What's going on, y'all? It's JD Piquel. Today on the Hard Count, we're going to talk about the best and worst case scenario for the leftover 8 teams in the Big 12 Conference. You know the drill. You know what we're doing here. Please subscribe to the channel. We're not begging you. We're asking you. It's a free country. If you would like to, I think it's a good idea. I think it's in your best interest. It's definitely in our best interest if you don't mind spreading the word. It helps us spread the channel, spread our presence, and allows us to do more cool things which we can then bring to you, which is ultimately the goal, because that's what we love, having a community that we can have a good back and forth with, good dialogue with, and ultimately provide the highest quality of content for the 365 sports community. So, it has been no secret. It's been well documented. Oklahoma and Texas, they're out. See ya, deuces. See ya, wouldn't want to be ya, to the Big 12, leaving them with 8 teams. And there is a myriad of possibilities. Everyone and their mother, including me and my mom, we've had good talks about it, about the realignment that is left for these 8 teams. Do you add teams? Do you ditch out and leave for another conference? Do you just stay 8 teams? I don't know how that would work. I think there's maybe some way you could piece together an 8-team conference. I don't know how that works with scheduling. Getting on a tangent there. Bottom line, you got to do something with these other 8 teams, whether it's adding teams or dissolving. And I personally think dissolving is probably the most effective way to go for the Big 12. I think it's probably the most likely way to go. So we're going to just go down the list here, team by team, and tell you the best and worst case scenario for all of these teams. Now, obviously, right off the bat, the best case scenario for all these teams is to end up in another Power 5 conference. You stay relevant, you stay financially viable. That's just the best case scenario across the board for all these teams. The worst case scenario will, for a lot of these teams, be the AAC. So I'm just prepping you. If I say the AAC a couple of times in this video, it's just because that's probably the worst case scenario, because at that point, you're down from Power 5 to the Group of 5, and that's just hard for your pride, but even more so hard for your wallet, which is ultimately, again, what's running this entire show. Like it or not, Greenback's calling the shots. So without further ado, West Virginia, the best case scenario, and I think honestly makes the most sense, would be a perfect fit, the ACC. They have the rivalries with Virginia Tech, the rivalries with Pitt. Geographically makes a lot of sense. West Virginia has trending upwards over the course of time since they left the Big East. I think it would be appealing for both parties, would be a really good marriage. If they can make that work, it would just be the most sensible thing ever. Now, worst case scenario, again, the AAC, you step back down to Group of 5 and you lose money. I think the big question here is there enough TV money there for West Virginia to be a viable option as they move forward into this madness, into the dark abyss that is the realignment scenario. Next, we got Baylor. And it has been documented to a degree of the reports of Baylor, TCU, Texas Tech, all having conversations with the Pac-12. And for Baylor, I think that's the best case scenario. And the way this is possible is if they attach themselves to Texas Tech and TCU. Because Baylor on its own is not that attractive. Small school, small private school, great basketball. I don't know how much it moves the needle in this conversation, but maybe it helps them a little bit. But ultimately, the market for Baylor is a lot more attractive if you say, hey, you get us as well as the rest of the Texas schools in the Big 12. So that's their big negotiating chip if you're Baylor. So Pac-12 would be awesome. I mean, ACC would be great too for those that are thinking maybe the Pac-12 is not going to take a religious school. Again, I have my own opinions on this, thinking that the Pac-12 needs to add somebody. Why not a school like Baylor, TCU, and Texas Tech? Another video that we've, again, already done another time. Worst case scenario, AAC. That's kind of the hot choice for a lot of people right now, is Baylor to go to the AAC because they think that the Pac-12 is going to laugh, shut their doors and say, no, we're not taking a Baptist school from Texas. Nice try. See you later. I think that is the worst case scenario. TCU, again, same deal. Pac-12, package deal with Texas Tech and Baylor. TCU is a little bit of a different scenario than Baylor and Texas Tech because TCU is a top 25 program in terms of TV views. They were, I think, 24 when you look at the 2019 stats. COVID's kind of its own thing, so we'll discount that. But bottom line, a lot of people want to watch TCU football, even though it's a smaller school, big market. Dallas-Fort Worth area, a lot of eyeballs, and that brand has sort of trended upward. Gary Patterson, I think, is probably also an appealing piece of adding TCU. Now, granted, I don't know how much longer he stays around, but could be interesting to have him in the mix when you talk about realignment. I don't know if he's, again, a super stable variable, but I think it is still something to consider. Worst case scenario, again, AAC. I don't see that happening. I think if TCU somehow ends up outside of a Power 5 conference, something has gone wildly wrong, and I think the administration, truthfully, would have just dropped the ball. Like, TCU has all the makings of moving to a Power 5 program with very little, I shouldn't say very little, with the least amount of resistance of the remaining 8 teams next to Oklahoma State, which we'll get to in a second. Next, this is an interesting one, Kansas. We've heard reports about them joining the Big Ten. That has been reported. We've heard they've been in conversations with the conference and seeing how that would work. Their big chip is basketball. It's no secret. Top of the line basketball program. They're a blue blood. Football leaves a lot to be desired. Again, when football's calling the shots, that makes you a little bit nervous as an AD, but I think there's still enough on the plate there to make them an appealing choice for the Big Ten if they did want to go and add a team like that from the Big 12. Now, the worst case scenario, and this is sort of going down the very, very worst case scenario. Like, if you watch Community, this is the darkest timeline. And if you don't watch Community, don't worry about that. This is just the worst case scenario. The FCS for Kansas. Now, again, a lot of things have to happen for this to be a reality. I don't think it's likely, but again, we're talking about worst case scenario, right? So hang on for a second. The legal trouble surrounding Kansas and the lack of competitive nature for their football program, the lack of money they bring in for their football program, would maybe make this a conversation. Basketball can still stay D1. Maybe basketball joins another conference. But for Kansas, I think it's not out of the realm of possibility, if enough things go wrong, for them to end up in the FCS. Now, I think they dominate the FCS, so that's one thing. I guess a step up from that would be Mountain West, American Athletic Conference. I mean, at that point, just kind of take your pick. But I think the very, very worst case scenario is FCS. I realize I'll get pushback on that. That's okay. We'll talk about it, and we'll see you in the comments. Texas Tech, again, same thing with Baylor and TCU. Package deal helps them the most. I think they're the most desperate brand in regards to TCU and Baylor and Texas Tech. I think they're the most desperate brand out of the 3. Baylor has the basketball national championship. TCU has the big market. Texas Tech's in Lubbock. The thing they do have going for them is the fact that they're not religiously affiliated like TCU and Baylor, because we've talked about that could be a potential hindrance for them as they try and join another conference. Remains to be seen how desperate other conferences are to add teams, because that could be, beggars can't be choosers. But for Texas Tech, I think that might make it a little easier for them to join another conference. So if they can join with the other 2 Texas schools, the Pac-12 would be a really nice fit, in my opinion. I think, again, worst case scenario, any group of 5. The American Athletic feels like a default because it's probably the most competitive group of 5. I shouldn't say probably. It is the most competitive group of 5, can pay you the most. A lot of y'all got on me in a previous video. Mountain West does not make more than the ACC. I was wrong, so I'm sorry for everyone that got after me for that one. The ACC is the best landing spot for a lot of these schools if they do go down a group of 5. Now, Kansas State, this is sort of an interesting one, because we talked about Kansas State being the odd man out if you were to leave a school out of a Power 5 school from the Big 12. The best case scenario, I think somehow if they could end up in the Big Ten, that makes sense geographically. If Kansas goes to the Big Ten, that best case scenario works out. Maybe they can work out a deal to go with them. But none of their sports are super awesome. Like, they have a lot of mediocre performance, so it doesn't make them a really appealing brand. Also, they don't make a ton of money. Like, good, not great compared to the rest of these guys. They're not necessarily knocking it out of the park. Again, group of 5 would be the worst case scenario. I think Mountain West could be one that makes sense geographically, but really just the little to no TV appeal. We'll see how much that comes into play, because again, that's calling the shots in this whole conversation, is how much can you make me if I bring you into my conference? The best case scenario for Iowa State's the Big Ten. They've talked to the Big Ten. I think the Iowa State rivalry would just go through the roof in terms of excitement. I'm sure you could make a way to make that more lucrative. People have gone back and forth with me in the comments and on social medias about how much they bring from a TV market standpoint. Listen, I don't know exactly what you bring, but I would imagine having both Iowa schools is better than having one Iowa school, right? Like, we can just agree on that probably. Having both Iowa schools in your conference, if you're able to capture the entire market of Iowa, probably a good thing. And also, Iowa State's just one of the best programs in the country going into this season. Now, again, I get that doesn't have a ton to do with the realignment conversation, but I think it's appealing. Worst case scenario, Mountain West or American, like a lot of the other programs. This would be surprising to me if they were to go that way, because of how competitive they are and their geographic location and just association with the Big Ten as it stands right now. I should say association. Reports of them talking to the Big Ten, if they dissolve, I feel really confident about them making that move. But, I mean, if they leave and Matt Campbell's the head coach, if they leave, meaning they leave the Big 12 and the Big 12 dissolves and they go to a smaller conference, like a group of 5, for example, Matt Campbell's out of there. Maybe he's out of there before. Maybe he sees the writing on the wall and takes an NFL job after this year. But you got to understand, if they drop down from Power 5, they're going to lose recruits, as will all these schools. And I think they definitely lose Matt Campbell because he'll have a built-in exit called the NFL, which I think he would gladly take for a nice little paycheck. Lastly, Oklahoma State. Heard reports about Big Ten, heard reports about Pac-12. That's not me saying I know more than anybody else. That's me saying I've just read stuff on The Athletic and heard reports on social media that's the two that are most interested in Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State, very similar to TCU in the sense that they have the chip of viewership, meaning they are one of the most watched teams in the country when it comes to views per week. I think they're number 19 as it stands right now. So that could be great. They have great sports, great football, great basketball. There's a lot of marketability with Oklahoma State. So some people have said, will they go with Oklahoma to the SEC? Don't see that happening. Don't think that's realistic. Would be shocked if that were the case. But I think that there's definitely a landing spot. Both them and TCU, I think, are your two you can pretty safely bet on landing somewhere in a Power 5 conference. And then maybe you talk about Iowa also being one that lands in a Power 5 conference pretty comfortably. But those two with their viewership, Oklahoma State and TCU, should land on their feet pretty comfortably. Similar to TCU, if Oklahoma State does end up in a Power 5 conference, that's on the administration, that's on the leadership, because you have all the firepower to end up somewhere. The worst case scenario, again, probably the American Athletic, but I would be really surprised if it ends up happening that way. I just don't think there's a way with all their brand power, all of their marketability, all their viewership to be turned away from a Power 5 conference. So again, the very worst case for all these teams is to somehow end up outside a Power 5 conference. We talked about it a little bit at the beginning of the video. The worst case, I think, the ultimate worst case, is for them to stay 8 teams. I don't know how that would work exactly. To be honest, I haven't looked into that enough. If you can even have a conference with that many teams and be considered a Power 5 conference. But bottom line, a lot of money be lost. Scheduling becomes a whole hassle. And again, that won't happen, but that would be the absolute worst thing, the apocalypse for the Big 12, if you will, being the Big 8. So that's it for us here at The Hard Count. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitter if you feel so inclined. We're going to be kicking it up here for college football season. 5 times a week when it gets rocking and rolling and they're playing football. We'll be talking about it here on 365 Sports. We'll keep this party rolling. We will see y'all next time.